Canadian exports that comply with the free trade agreement get a carve-out from those border security tariffs. Right now, they're set at 25%. But what is and what isn't compliant, that can lead to some big questions. Joining us from Washington with the answers is the wonderful Mike Crawley. Mike, walk us through the exemptions for CUSMA-compliant goods. We talk about that phrase so much, CUSMA-compliant, but walk us through the exemptions.
Yeah, and Katie, I know that you know this stuff probably better than anybody else in Canada, but for all of us who haven't been following it quite so closely, let's do a quick breakdown, basically, of the different tariffs that are in place on Canadian exports to the U.S. right now. And we're going to start with the tariffs on certain sectors. So there's the steel and aluminum tariffs. That's the biggest number right now, 50%, and that's a global tariff, not just on Canada. There's also a tariff on the non-U.S. content of assembled automobiles. That's 25%. Now, unfortunately, for this category of tariffs, that exemption under the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement, or CUSMA, that exemption doesn't help, at least not as things stand right now. Then there's, though, the tariff that applies to everything else. This is what you refer to as the border security tariff. Sometimes people call it the fentanyl tariff. This is the one that Trump imposed back in March when he declared that fentanyl trafficking across the northern border was a national emergency. So it's 25% on products of Canada, and that's the rate that Trump is threatening to push up to 35% on his deadline of August 1st, which is Friday. The rate on energy, potash, and critical minerals is just 10%. But here's the thing with all of this category of tariffs: products that comply with the CUSMA rules of origin are exempt. So that means that they can enter the U.S. with zero tariff. And according to an analysis by RBC Economics, you're talking nearly 90% of the value of Canadian exports to the U.S. can qualify for that exemption. So look, the exporting companies, they got to do some paperwork, they got to jump through some hoops to get this exemption, but it is there for the taking, and it is a really big deal for Canada.
All right, Mike, you mentioned this CUSMA exemption applies to the tariff that Trump is threatening to raise it. Right now it's at 25%. On Friday, it could go up to 35% if there's no new deal by then. So when you factor in the exemption, how does Canada's situation shape up against the tariff deals that Trump just reached with the European Union and Japan?
Yeah, Katie, that's a really important question because although Canada is facing the same deadline that the EU and Japan were facing, and all these other countries are facing, Canada is actually not facing the same level of impact from the threat that's looming with this deadline. In fact, the impact is substantially lower. Look, Europe and Japan were staring down blanket tariffs across pretty much all of their exports. And in Canada's case, the vast majority of exports can enter the U.S. tariff-free because of CUSMA. So that's why you've got a lot of economic observers out there saying you can't look at these deals that the EU and Japan got with Trump and just look at the numbers, that they're 15% across-the-board tariffs. You can't compare that with Canada and say, hey, how come Europe and Japan got 15% and Canada's stuck with 25 and looking at possibly 35? You got to think of it this way. Would you rather have a 15% tariff on nearly all of your exports, or would you be okay with 25 or 35%, given that it applies to only a fraction of your exports? So it's these exemptions that matter, or the carve-outs. And Canada's CUSMA carve-out is a really big exemption that those other trading blocs don't have. So whether Canada gets a deal by Friday to bring down that 25% to something that's comparable to the EU, or even if Trump goes ahead and he imposes that 35% on Friday, you got plenty of observers out there saying that this CUSMA exemption is giving Canada a big competitive advantage over these other countries. Tariff-free access to the U.S. for the vast bulk of our exports in a world where at least some level of tariffs on some products are the new reality, the new, cost of doing business with Trump. And of course, that's so long as Trump leaves that CUSMA exemption in place.
Yeah, and that is the big question. So far, the White House is indicating that they are going to keep those exemptions in place. But then again, you have the tariffs on steel and aluminum and some for the auto sector. And it makes everything so complicated and difficult. But that CUSMA-compliant, those exemptions, they are the view from the White House is that they are quite significant and that Canada does have an advantage. And that is the view from, the Trump administration. Okay, thank you very much, Mike. Thanks. You can find Mike's analysis online. Look look for that story on our CBC News page. This is CBC Morning Live.